Bert, thanks for joining us. My name is Steve Capone, and I'm the editor-in-chief here at Whisper House Press, and we are putting out Costs of Living, September 1st of 2025. And in preparation for that, we're interviewing as many authors who contributed as are willing to be interviewed and happy to be interviewed. And we know not everybody loves that, and that's totally cool too. But you offered to be interviewed. I appreciate that. And I would love it if you could first introduce yourself to the readers, however you want to do that, whatever you want to say about yourself.
I am Gavera, Bert, Piedmont, and I introduce people to myself to people as a neurodivergent swamp witch, cyborg who's living at the side of a frog pond in the Connecticut woods. And although that sounds very peculiar, every word of that is the absolute truth. I am a weird fiction horror writer. I have 3 cats and a husband. I also just started branching out myself into editing anthologies. So I have both novels and anthologies now under my belt, and I'm going to continue to alternate back and forth and do both. Excited to be in this anthology. I wrote a really fun story, and I hope we get to talk about it.
I wonder if you could tell us where, like you mentioned, you have some novels under your belt, you have some anthologies under your belt. Could you rattle off a couple of those for us to look for if we really loved the short story that we may have already read in our collection, or maybe people read it and then they decide they want to find more of your stuff?
I have a short story collection of related short stories called The Maw and Other Time Traveling Lizard Tales, which actually is part of the same series as my story in your anthology, which is all about dinosaurs and time traveling lizards and such. The corporation Unita, as in Unita Raptor, shows up several times in the Maw. So if you enjoy Incident at the HOA, you will probably enjoy the stories in the Maw. And eventually I will be putting out another short story collection because I just keep writing stories about dinosaurs and time traveling lizards. I don't know why. I have a trilogy out about a paranormal investigator called Mickey Crow who has a cybernetic arm. She may or may not be a Native American. You'll find out why we don't know. They're called Shiver, Formless, and Metal will probably be out by the time you watch this. It's about killer robots. Formless is about shoggoths. Shiver is about mermaids that are half shark.
That's so great.
They're really fun, quick, kind of a monster of the week
Yeah.
books, like a quick, fun read. And I also have a short story that was published in an anthology, so I'm going to be putting them together in like a big fat book with the 3 novels and the short story, like kind of omnibus. And then my anthologies, I have a series of anthologies called Yankee Scares that are going to be all set in Connecticut by Connecticut authors. The first one came out this year and it's called Horror Over the Handlebars, and it's coming of age in the 80s and 90s. So think like It and Stranger Things. I have another duology that's called Necronama Rom-Com. There's 2 volumes, light and dark. The light one I call the delightful volume, and that's the one where the characters stay together and they're slightly more fluffy and the dog doesn't die. The dark volume is the frightful volume where either the characters don't stay together and the world ends and the dog does die. Unfortunately, I didn't write these stories. And then I have a hardcover omnibus that's got all the stories in it. There's 39 stories and 4 poems total. And that was so much fun to do. I mean, all I had to do was tell people that I was doing an anthology called Necronama Rom-Com, and people were like, that is brilliant. I need to be in that. If you want some kind of goofy, off-the-shelf Cthulhu mythos stories, you want to pick that up. I have one novel that I wrote with my friend. It's called Aresford, and it's the only zombie book ever written by an actual zombie, I think, because she is a zombie and it has zombie in it. And we say it's Harry Potter meets 50 Shades of Grey meets Walking Dead if Terry Pratchett wrote it. There you go. So you can find me on Amazon, Gavera, Bert, Piedmont. And I also make some like blank journals with pretty covers, and those come up too.
I wonder if you could introduce us to your story. And I have to say, This story is our lead-off suburban horror story, and it most spoke to the theme in a very direct way. Can you tell us a little bit about this story? Maybe don't spoil it, but just like give us the vibe of it, the gist of what's going on at the beginning of the story or what we're in for.
How about if I tell you what inspired it? I hang out a lot on Reddit, and there was a post in one of the Am I the Asshole subreddits about this guy who his daughter loved alpacas or llamas, I forget which. And so for her ninth birthday party, he rented one to come to her party, and the person who brought it came dressed all up in traditional Peruvian dress. And it was a huge hit. All the kids loved it and were playing with it and petting it. And he said the worst part was his daughter cried at the end because she thought she got to keep it. But the problem was that the homeowner association got all upset because they decided this fuzzy camel was a dangerous animal. And I'm reading that and I'm like, the worst they're going to do is spit on you, right? I mean, an alpaca or a llama are not dangerous. The consensus was that the guy was not an asshole, though maybe he should have warned his daughter that she didn't get to keep the llama or whatever. I made a joke about like this llama or alpaca roaming the neighborhood, foaming at the mouth, chasing down the HOA members. And somebody said I would pay to read that story. And I joked underneath, maybe I should write it. And then boom, my brain went, let's go write that. Except, of course, because I'm me and my time traveling lizards and my dinosaurs immediately went to my teacup velociraptors. And how much fun would it be if someone had a children's birthday party and brought teacup velociraptors? And what would the HOA say to that? And there the story just unfolded. I didn't really have to do much once that happened in my head. And then I decided I needed everybody to have ridiculous names. And I went to my friend who is a lawyer who works with real estate people. And I gave it to him to read. And I said, make sure this is as outrageously real estate-ness as we could. So he pushed it up a couple notches before you even saw it. I reread it and I was like, this may be the funniest thing I've ever written. I'm like, this guy's going to hate it. And I sent it to you and you immediately wrote back and was like, I love this.
It was a no doubter, like they say in baseball. Like it was like, this is perfect. I love it. So I'm just glad that you saw the call for submissions.
Was talking about it. I have all these discords for my anthologies, and I mentioned, oh, I just wrote this funny HOA story for this charity anthology I do every year. And they said, oh, there's somebody looking for specifically HOA stories. And I was like, oh, I'm like, well, I'll send it to them and they won't take it. And then I'll send it to the charity anthology anyway.
Well, I'm glad you did. I'm really, really glad that you saw that.
No, I am too, because this is great.
So can we just talk a little bit about horror generally? And when we talk about horror and we tell people that we like to read horror or write horror, usually people have a very specific idea. Other than other horror writers, we're pretty broad stroke folks when it comes to the super genre of horror. Most people have a very specific idea of what we mean when we say horror, but usually it's not exactly what we mean. So I wonder, could you tell us what comes to your mind? What's maybe a functional definition of the genre or the mood or whatever you might want to call it? What makes something horror?
I think it needs to make you feel uneasy. There needs to be something about it that's just wrong. Some element, whether it's like uncanny valley or whatever, there's just something about the situation, something about the person, something about the animal, something about the house that's just off enough that you're uneasy. And that's what's going to draw you in. You're reading this story and you're saying, what is this? What's going on? I want to know why this is not quite right. And I think that's the definition of horror. And whether, like I said, whether it's another person, an animal, a place, something has to be off and you feel it in your gut when you're reading. Just like sometimes you meet a person and you're like, ugh, the story has to do that to you. You have to be like, there's something wrong here. And that's horror. And a lot of times, I mean, my horror is so weird. I tell people I write weird fiction because I've noticed when I'm at a general author event selling, when I'm with like other horror authors and we're like, oh, we're horror authors, there's people who will walk by and won't look at our stuff.
Yeah.
And I think they're losing a chance to read some really good stuff because they have this idea in their mind of what horror is, and they
Yeah.
think it's like guts on the floor.
They think slasher, which some horror is. They think extreme
Which it
horror.
is,
Yeah,
which it is, but I'm not going to say there's no guts on the floor in my story because, there might be, but all horror is not guts on the floor.
yeah,
And if that's all you think that horror is, you're missing out. You're missing out on some
yeah.
stuff that's super nuanced and some stuff that's super fun. And I get kind of mad when my friends are like, "Ooh, we're the horror writers." And people are like, "Nope." And they walk on by and I'm like, "I got stuff that's not horror. Like, come to me. Come here."
I think I was one of those people who just walked on by for a long time. As a kid, I read Stephen King, and that was it. Maybe some Michael Crichton or something, but like thrillers and then Stephen King horror. And I read Edgar Poe and I read Lovecraft in college. But then there was this decade, at least, where I didn't read any horror. And in part, it was because I thought horror wasn't like serious. It was like guaranteed not to be good literature, and it was me being a pompous idiot basically. And since I'd say about 5 years ago, when I fell into books like Jeff Vandermeer's Born or Annihilation, Grady Hendrix's Horror Store, which is basically
I
The
love
Shining in an
that.
IKEA, those books made me realize, oh, horror is not just what Stephen King writes. And that's not necessarily a knock on Stephen King, because I still enjoy reading Stephen King, but horror, it offers social commentary. Horror offers a view into, or maybe ask questions about the unknown. It's kind of a, I think it's kind of a quadrant of speculative fiction, which I've always liked and I never got away from. To me, it's like I had to allow myself to like what I like. And I like weird fiction and I like horror. My pompous 20 something self really didn't want to allow me to admit that I really like the messages, the medium, the method of expressing emotions in horror. It just speaks to me. And now here I am, I'm reading 80, 90 horror books a year. They just hit different, like the kids say. I'm with you on that. That I think people are missing out. I know I was missing out. I'm glad not to be missing so much these days. If anybody's watching and you're not quite sure, I mean, I hope people read this volume and see that the horror in it is super varied. There's some grotesque, there's some absurd, there's some silly, there's some scary, like there's some monsters, there's some creepy crawlies. It's like all this different stuff. And yours really straddles the incident with the HOA, really straddles a line between absurd scary and absurd hilarious, so that it's not exactly one or the other. There are pieces of it that seem more like horror and there are pieces of it that seem more like humor, and it's just the right mix. I wonder if you were thinking about that, like how far can I push this? Is it horror? Like, were you thinking about it being horror as you wrote it? Or were you just like, this is a crazy story?
I was thinking about it being crazy. I can't write funny on purpose. Funny to me is only accidental. Like Airs for the other book that I wrote with my friend, she wrote most of the funny parts. So funny to me is something that does not come natural. It's something that's accidental. And I find it after I wrote it, I'm like, oh, this part is really funny. But if I'm like, I'm going to write a funny story, it is going to fail. I wanted to go for something that was completely and utterly Karen, the stereotypical Karen and the stupid HOA rules. So I wanted to mash the two together. And then I decided to put the stupid names in there, which I think is part of what pushed it to absurdity with the ridiculous names. I was just like, if you take like the most Karen of Karens, and then I put 3 people named Karen in there, all spelled differently, and mushed them together with stupid HOA rules, I think that made the absurdity. And then the horror is what actually happened that day is horrible. If you read between the lines, it's absolutely horrible what happened to those children and to the people on that cul-de-sac. That's the horror. Karen Newton glosses over that horror because she's nitpicking at what she can make fines for. So I
And
think
there's a horror
that's
in
the
that. There's,
that's the true horror in it,
yeah,
is that she really doesn't care who died. She cares if she can find this guy for it.
yeah.
And that's really what's horrible about it. It's
Who
more
cares about
important to
her
her that
power?
she can find people. Yes, she's this horrible, power hungry bitch. And she's just basically like, well, someone's petunias got pooped into, and this and that. And it's all this minutia, not even thinking that, oh, the guy at the gate wouldn't let the cops through when people are getting murdered on the street. Why is this happening? Like, when you really like pull it apart, like that's really what I was trying to say, like how horrible these rules are. To me, the rules are even more horrible than what my little velociraptors did, because I love my little velociraptors.
Really, do you think we missed anything that you want to talk about, express, or request, or any thoughts on your mind that you want to share?
Well, I mean, I could give you my social media.
Please do.
Okay, so on Facebook, my author page is GaveraBertPiedmont.com, just Facebook / my name. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. If you're not on Facebook, on Instagram, I am the only Miss Bert, all one word. And my website is obsidianbutterfly.com.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the level of engagement like throughout this process. Because of what an amazing, awesome experience this has been, I'm looking forward to doing another one as soon as possible. It's been such a joy to work with you all.
Great.
Thanks for
Thank
your
you.